welcome to Laura Bear, an old colleague of mine. I'm delighted that she's agreed to come and present her new work to us. Laura Bear, as you know, is an anthropologist who teaches at the Anthropology Department across the road and at the LSC. Has worked for several years on a rather fine novel called Jadoo House, on an Anglo-Indian community in Calcutta, and recently published a monograph on the life of the railways and railway colonies called Lifelines of the Nation. Laura today is going to talk to us about the waterscape of the Hooghly River, and the kinds of connections and, I guess, disjunctures between the river and the landscape around it, and the kinds of different worlds it brings together, bureaucracy of capital and culture. Thank you, Laura. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Betty. And it's great if you want to continue the conversations after this talk. I'm just across the road in LSE, so please come if you're interested in this material. So the title of my talk today is Making a River of Gold, Publicity, Friendship and Entrepreneurial Society on the Hooghly. And I really want to first of all talk about the relationship between friendship and economic governance. Now, unlike patronage or corruption, the place of friendship in bureaucratic practice has not been fully explored. And this perhaps reflects a wider romance of friendship within capitalism, that it is an intimate relationship of mutuality which supports trust and the sharing of tacit knowledge. And Alice with quite diverse approaches from Hayek, Ranulota, Hart and Elijah take this perspective on friendship. Now, what I'm going to do in the paper now is I'm going to reveal other aspects of friendship as an effective relation of economic life. And I'm going to reflect on friendship not as a matter of trust and knowledge, but of complicity and speculation. I'm going to explore the inequality it generates through its passionate pursuit of prosperity. And I will show that far from being spontaneous, friendship has a public life linked to new forms of economic governance associated with liberalisation in India. And most importantly, I'm going to show how friendship creates an invisible liminal zone between the market and the state. And in this, state promises, or plans and policies as they're usually known, can be brought into relation with personal promises between friends to generate a future. Now, these reflections on friendship are really being provoked by my recent 2 years of research on the Hooghly River in Kolkata. And my work in that, on that river took in the whole waterscape. So I did field work in the Kolkata docks, which are up here on the left here. I spent time on the river with the container ship pilots, river pilots that take the ships, sort of the 125 kilometers down to the Bay of Bengal. I also did field work in the shipyards, the private sector shipyards that have been growing up around since liberalisation along the river. And these are actually building ships for a Norwegian shipping firm that's outsourced with several intermediaries. And also I worked with some of the low-level bureaucrats on the river, which include this man, Mr. Bones, to inspect and license barges, small barges on the river. Now, importantly, although I worked in all of these very different places on the river, they were all connected together through friendship. And it was actually within the lineaments of those implicit relationships that I moved during my fieldwork. And this friendship had a particular verb that was used to describe it, to joga-jog-kora. Now, this verb has its origins in a play on words. To add and subtract is to jog-jog-kora, but to joga-jog-kora is to add and then add again, thereby building an expanding network of people. To joga-jog-kora is to accrue potentially limitless influence in the city. And in it, idioms of accountancy and effect combine in the pursuit of ties that turn strangers into friends. Now, of course, this is a very widespread mode of representing and navigating the sociality of urban spaces such as Kolkata. This is a very commonly used idea to joga-jog-kora. But I'll show that it's taken on an increased importance on the Hooghly River. And I'll argue that it's in fact the unpredictable medium, speculative medium for forging public-private partnerships. Now, I didn't understand how this friendship worked until I'd spent several months joining the flow of complicit relationships on the Hooghly and through these, the plans and revenue streams of the state-run Kolkata Port Trust were connected to the work of entrepreneurs and their labour forces. And at the centre of these practices were apparently minor officials, such as this boat registration officer, Mr. Bose, that you can see here. Mr. Bose was connected through networks of voting into the informal sector shipyards and into the docks. Yeah, you can see the kind of texture of this friendship a bit from the photograph. Now, Mr. Bose presided over a very dilapidated, apparently inconsequential waterfront office at a place called Uttarampart. Now, this office stood among the ruins of old port jetties for people working in the informalised sector, and daily assembled in this office were an unlikely collection of people from boatmen, labour contractors, high-level bureaucrats, pimps and entrepreneurs. And this open access had been created by Mr. Bose in order to generate new sources of state income on the river. And his official role was just to license and inspect vessels to ensure public safety, so he had a very restricted official role. But his office had actually become a node in the vast range of private sector activities, as for all the port offices. And from our first meeting, he encouraged me to join him on his inspection tours on the Hooghly. My presence, of course, enabled him to claim a very wide sphere of influence, and he liked to say to people while I was there, I don't have a passport and I don't need to, because everyone from the world comes to my office. I was evidence of that, obviously. And here people came to, they said, to Jogjopura. Now, in this paper, by focusing on the practices of Mr. Bose and his clients, I will explore how their friendships bring into being a new kind of entrepreneurial society, as well as revealing key shifts associated with liberalisation. This ethnographic situation, I think, is theoretically important, and I'm now going to talk a little bit about its theoretical importance before turning to the ethnography itself. So what I'm proposing is a new way of thinking about economic governance that includes speculation and implicit friendship. And I think this is important because it takes us beyond an idea of bureaucratic knowledge as the ways in which bureaucracies govern. Now, the question of knowledge has dominated discussions of economic governance. Disagreements, in fact, between socialist planners and opponents of market regulation have centred on who is in the best position to know the complex reality of the economy. And of course, Marx very famously argued that state planning was necessary because no single capitalist had enough information to orchestrate the rational management of the total social product. For Hayek, it was only the entrepreneur who possessed the tacit knowledge to discern the creative possibilities of circulation. But here, I want to move away from this old tradition of thinking about economic governance by asking a different set of questions. What if the planning of economic action is not a matter of information alone? What if circulation emerges out of attempts to stimulate speculation? What if secrecy and complicity, as well as transparency and knowledge, are central to economic action? The practices of Jogjopura allow us to raise and explore these kinds of questions. Quite unlike an exchange of knowledge, Jogjopura is a pursuit that seeks to create influence over the projects of others. And I suggest that Jogjopura reveals that complicit speculative friendship is always important to economic governance. Now, the existing anthropology of bureaucracies governing the economy, or of bureaucracies in general, is not really sufficient to help us understand these growing practices of friendship. It too has focused on questions of knowledge. Recent work has emphasised expertise, audit, market devices, and documentary practices. To fully understand Jogjopura, it's necessary to return to an old and neglected theme in anthropology. We need to revive the study of the connections between friendship, complicity, and state-society relationships. One of the earliest accounts that suggests there's a connection between these domains is Simmel's discussion of secrecy in social relations. He argued that relationships are forged through a fascination with the play of concealment and revelation. Moments of revelation of secrets in particular create new forms of complicity between individuals, and such disclosures suggest the possibility of a parallel second world alongside the obvious surface of relations. This world is seen as essential and significant, and Simmel argues, is heightened by fantasy to distinguish it by a degree of attention that published reality could not command. Now, Simmel places the confidences of friendship within this framework, but interestingly, Simmel argued wrongly that this world of complicity and the secret becomes progressively more private in modern capitalist societies. He suggested that accounting, archiving, and democracy, all the features of the modern state, led to a growth of publicity around state and capitalist institutions. He argued then that the secret retreats to the sphere of personal relationships. But this only tells part of the story. In fact, the promise of transparent record-keeping, accounting, and publicity, I would argue, generates an increasing emphasis on relationships founded on the sharing or withholding of secrets. These offer the complicity of knowing the truth that exists alongside the public truth. So as the forms of accountancy multiply, accountability multiply, this other domain, this secret and complicity also amplifies as well. Now, there is an older, quite rich ethnographic exploration of these kinds of implicit relationships in the anthropology of the Mediterranean, from Pitt Rivers and Campbell's discussions of instrumental friendship onwards. Now, I think this ethnography is interesting because there's a recurrent finding in this literature that we can build on to understand the kinds of friendship that I'm talking about. And this ethnography shows that friendship is a social relationship that's made in a liminal zone in which the rules of engagement are much more fluid than in kinship or patronage. Friendship then is characterized by improvised ties across ethical and social boundaries. Now, this work, combined with Simmel's emphasis on secrecy, can help us to understand the significance of friendship to economic governance. Through the pursuit of friendship, bureaucrats and entrepreneurs can suspend their usual ethics and rules. They can engage in the pursuit of mutual speculation without dissolving the boundaries between public and private economies. Personal promises and state promises can combine creatively to negotiate a future in this liminal zone. Now, this older literature shows that friendship has always been significant to state-society relationships. So how are we to understand its new uses? Other ethnographies would suggest that recent economic policies aim to harness personal relationships in new ways. Elijah, for example, has traced how NGO microfinance programs in Egypt incorporate networks of what she calls wasta. And as the paper that follows shows, as I'll show in the rest of my talk, quite a similar process is at work on the Hooghly in relation to Jogo-Jogo-Koro. A mode of relationality associated with popular urban connections is becoming more closely tied to the revenue streams and planning of the state. Except these effective relations are not simply harnessed, but are amplified. In addition, bureaucrats make their authority and state tokens available to these complicit networks in new ways. Popular practices for negotiating the city are now used to solicit income for state institutions and to act on state policies. Now, this drawing close of state institutions to networks of friendship is problematic. It creates new possibilities, but it also generates new inequalities. In much of the world where the urban poor work in the informalised sector, these practices involve bureaucrats in the direct creation of unprotected forms of work. Deunionising casual labour is predominant, as we know, throughout India, where 83% of workers operate in the informalised sector. Now, importantly, much of the literature on South Asia and elsewhere has argued that this workforce, this informalised workforce, exists because of the indifference or corruption of state bureaucrats. And an influential literature has coined the term political society to describe the situation of the working poor who exist in this unregulated zone beyond civil society, negotiating temporary rights through patronage. Now, there are many critiques of this model, but importantly, the practices of Jogo-Jogo-Koro reveal another limit to this theory. And this is the point that bureaucrats in liberalisation India do not ignore, but seek to harness and increase this informalised sector. And in this paper, I'm going to use the phrase entrepreneurial society to really describe and bring into view these emerging relationships. Now, to understand this social form, we have to shift our optic away from patronage alone to examine complicit friendship. Although friendship has always been important, the ethnography that follows shows it is becoming a central mechanism of economic governance. So now, for the ethnography, what are the changes in state practices that have made friendship so central on the Hooghly? Why is it that bureaucrats and entrepreneurs live the pursuit of job with such enthusiasm? What are the possibilities and inequalities that emerge from these practices? And what are their consequences for a political critique of policies of public-private partnership? And it's answering these questions that I'm going to turn to next in relation to the ethnography. So the next sort of section of the ethnographic section of the paper is called Speculative Planning, Publicity and Secrets in the Calcutta Port Trust. So what then are the changes to state practices that have made friendships so central to economic governance on the Hooghly? Now the answer to this question importantly lies in a hidden side to the process of liberalisation in India. This is a shift in the role of the central state in relation to its capital-generating bureaucracies such as the Calcutta Port Trust. Before the 1980s, there was long-term social investment in these institutions orchestrated in 5-year plans. Through the 1980s and increasing from the 1990s, this policy has shifted to the extraction of income through short-term devolved planning. This development is linked to a change in the concept and mechanisms of sovereign debt following worldwide patterns. Sovereign debt, if you can imagine it, was once a means of social investment under the control of political institutions. But it has steadily become a technocratic problem of debt repayment linked to market institutions such as the new bond markets and debt. And this has created a gradual marketization of public sector debt relationships since the 1980s. Public financing is driven by the demands of higher commercial interest payments. Economic policy focuses on the government's reputation in bond markets. And this has led steadily to the imposition of austerity measures on institutions across the world as well as in India. For the Calcutta Port Trust, this shift came with the central government calling in permanently frozen debts in the 1990s. Now, importantly, these debts had been incurred from infrastructure investments in the 1960s and the 70s, and these were suddenly treated as fiscal debts. These were really grants from the government that had been permanently frozen, but these were suddenly classified as fiscal debts that had to be repaid from the Port Trust to the central government with accrued interest for all of the intervening years. In addition, the Port Trust has been increasingly funded through private sector loans, and this has plunged the port into permanent crisis in spite of its sharply rising levels of trade and income since liberalisation. In response, port officials cut their labour forces from 33,000 in 1981 to 8,000 in 2000. Work has been increasingly outsourced to private family firms who rely on informal, ununionised labour. Bureaucrats have sought any creative way they can to extract revenue from the river and its infrastructure. And it means that you get this extraordinary situation that container ships come up the river. This is Singapore docks, right? This is like the epitome of the contemporary, high-tech dock system. And actually, the ships come up the Hooghly River to the Calcutta docks. This is as much a global site as this one. But it looks like this because of this extraction of income by the central government from the Port Trust and total lack of investment, which is to do with this changing concept of public debt. Now, importantly, you're probably surprised to hear about these fiscal crises or changes in debt policy because none of this appears in the publicly issued 5-year plans of the central government. Instead, from the 1990s, these have called for public-private partnerships and the generation of revenue. And what this has created is a decentralised practice of speculative planning. And this is led by whatever schemes local-level bureaucrats can negotiate with family firms, other state agencies and politicians. But then how does this new speculative planning work? The answer in part lies in the growth of the Public Relations Department in the port. This office was founded in 1991 to engage with these new constituencies. They had now become relevant to realising the port's schemes, and the PR department was gradually given increased responsibilities. Now it organises public events, it plants stories in the press to ease negotiations, it publicises plans and share issues. Now this publicity does more than just bring into being a neoliberal aesthetics or create productive romances, which is how Ashoka and Nigel Thrift have written about it. This publicity is central to the play of concealment and disclosure that generates the friendships through which economic governance now occurs. Publicity is a technique that creates a mesmerizing split between what is made clear and what might yet remain still opaque. And it's this compelling split that's deployed by officials to forge complicity. So by 2008, when I'd started out my fieldwork, publicity had become vital for the stimulation of Jogo. Whenever I attended publicity events, I would encounter this mesmerizing split in reality generated by them. Speeches from officials, foreign ambassadors and ministers depicted a paternalist history of the state on the river that continued through the present in entrepreneurial partnerships. This is a press release in the newspaper about one of these events that I attended. And, it's celebrating 138-year-long voyage of Kolkata Port Trust, steering by the stars for tomorrow's harvest. There's an emphasis on continuity in this paternalist project. You can't really see, but there was the Consul General of Japan there, the chairman of the Port Trust, various officials, and then all of the kind of private and family companies and very large companies that work on the river, all of their representatives were in attendance. So you had Tata Iron and Steel Company, Maersk India, and then smaller Stream Agency, which is a small family firm. Now, in these events, very grand future schemes were announced for redevelopment and prosperity. Now, always officials would then confide secrets to me about the proceedings, revealing what the ministers had actually said behind the scenes or which press stories had been planted. I mean, press stories are literally planted in the newspapers to generate debate. Now, these events created two types of publics. One public was obviously the citizenry of Calcutta, who would receive assurances in the next day's papers of the prosperous future of the port. The other was that of entrepreneurs, state officials and politicians, and they would soon be hearing confidences similar to those the officials had just told me. Now, bound together in these exchanges, they would then pursue the future prosperity promised in the speeches. Now, these negotiations produce a reality quite different from that presented in the publicised plans. And relevant examples for understanding the boat registration office are state promises for the regeneration of the waterfront in central Kolkata and of the shipbuilding trade on the river. Since the 1990s, Publicity has promised a redevelopment of the core properties in central Kolkata. In fact, I think Mamata Banerjee, when she came into power recently, last year, also announced that she was going to turn the waterfront into the equivalent of the Thames waterfront as well. This is a kind of recurrent dream that's been kept going since the 1980s. Now, following worldwide models, this would include shopping malls, museums, and middle-class housing. But the negotiations of Jogo ended in a stalemate, as various state, political, and entrepreneurial agencies tried to grab the valuable waterfront land. So along most of the waterfront, now a semi-legal economy of sex work and sand extraction for construction has developed. And as you will see, the port now directly profits from taxing and licensing these trades through the boat registration office. A similar divergent outcome is visible in the plans for the stimulation of the shipbuilding trade. Announcements were made by the port in the 1990s that a renaissance of the Hooghly would come through private shipbuilding, bringing the latest technologies to the river. But through negotiations of Jogo, a string of private shipyards, like I showed you in the first photograph, with minimum infrastructure and informalised labour gradually developed. And these are building, as I said, ships for the port, they're building ships for international companies, Norwegian companies. So the state sector, including the port, outsourced work to these shipyards. Now, in both of these cases, state plans have acted in a different way from in the past. They form the foundation for unpredictable speculation and negotiation. And as we will see, the boat registration office taps into the informalised economies generated by these earlier state promises and amplifies them further through Jogo. Now I'm going to take you into this world of implicit friendship. And I'm going to show how the people engaged in these friendships associate them with the production of a new public good on the river. And I'll examine how Jogo is generated by bureaucrats. And I'll trace the inequalities and possibilities of this new entrepreneurial society that's emerging from these practices. So we're back with Mr. Bose. Here's Mr. Bose on his stuff. It's always on his stuff. So now I'm going to talk about the growth of this entrepreneurial society through friendship and patronage. So patronage appears here in a different way than it usually does. So I now want to think first about this new public good of the liberalisation of bureaucrats. I said that these are not just simply cynical behind-the-scenes negotiations. These are a new passion or a new pursuit. bureaucrats did was they practiced a combination of personal friendship and state patronage to the poor in order to, as many of them put it, make a river of gold. The aim was to create prosperity by drawing informalized economies into the orbit of their influence, and this was achieved through a deployment of friendship with equals and patronage towards the working poor. And now I'm going to talk through how Mr. Bowes, in particular in the Boat Registration Office, used these practices. Importantly, he's just one example of these. He was a very typical and also highly influential man who turned up in all of my field sites and my offices, and what I saw going on in his office was going on in all the low-level bureaucratic offices along the river. Now, Mr. Bowes, importantly, didn't relate his work to the commercial freedoms of liberalisation. He described it as a project of bringing a paternalist nation-state closer to its citizens. And his ethics were based on a very strange, eclectic combination. They included benevolent patronage, the rhetoric of the 2005 Right to Information Act, and entrepreneurship. As Mr. Bowes put it, the only section that is large now in the report is the Public Relations Department, but I do all the public relations in my office. I don't just enforce the rules, I make people understand the rules. They pay something and they have rights. We have to go close to them. I could convert the river into a river of gold if they gave me the proper hands to do this. Now, his aim of producing a river of gold, like that of other bureaucrats, had a specific Bengali nationalist inflection. He modelled himself on Rani Rashmi, the Zamindari or landlord patroness of Ramakrishna, who prevented the British from levying an unfair tax on fishermen on the Hooghly in the 19th century. He also sought to overcome the loss of boats and men during partition in 1947 and the draining of river water to Bangladesh since the opening of the Farakka barrage. Lost prosperity would be returned to the Hooghly, restoring a Sona Bangla, golden Bengal. This could only be fully achieved, however, Mr. Bowes suggested, if you acted on the river with the same controlling power as Shiva had on Mar when she descended to earth. Now, alongside these rich Bengali nationalist and Hindu resonances, he also described his actions as driven by the 2005 Right to Information Act that made the state transparent to its citizens. And in fact, the computerization of his records in line with this legislation was occurring in this waterfront shack that he worked in. But how had Mr. Bowes set about generating revenue in a way that was informed by these ethics and sentiments? Mr. Bowes, under pressure from the chairman to meet new aggressive revenue targets, set about looking for a means to gather income. And he achieved this by drawing boat owners, boatmen or hajis, and other entrepreneurs into the orbit of his office. Most importantly, he broke the illicit nexus of taxation and seizure to control the movement of vessels on the river. This was actually run by the Boatmen Union, their representative who was a sannyasin, and local representatives of the CPIM party. Now, Mr. Bowes, along with other port officials, persuaded the police to break this ring up, using journalists to further their cause. Now the inspection and licensing revenue was running again through the office, which it had not done for 20 years or so or more. But Mr. Bowes went further than this redirection of income streams. He drew entrepreneurs into his sphere of influence and aimed to increase their activity. This, he reasoned, would regenerate the river and create more revenues for his office, and this is where the practices of Jojo Kora were central. So what then were the forms of this friendship, and how was it forged? When entrepreneurs first came into contact with Mr. Bowes, he combined officializing and personalizing forms of address. In addition, he drew on various sources of legitimacy. These included state documents, publicized plans, threats, and growing intimacy. And it was the improvised use of all of these that created an atmosphere of hovering secrets and influence. And Mr. Bowes' incitement of connection was most visible in his management of the construction sand trade. So this is the trade where men go to the middle of the river and collect sand at low tide, which is then sold on for construction of the new towns in Rajaghat. Now, it was the owners of these boats and the Golobaris, the middlemen who sell on the sand to the construction companies who sought help in Mr. Bowes' office. Owners rented boats to Marji's boatmen, who then recruited the crew. And the Golobaris, the middlemen, gave an interest-free loan to the Marjis, and this was an advance on their labour that has to be returned in the form of sand. Now, Mr. Bowes' official role was just to inspect these boats during their annual survey and to renew the licence When he was first approached, Mr. Bowes gave people advice that established his role as a powerful potential friend. For example, when a novice Golabari approached him one day, Mr. Bowes spoke in an alternately authoritative and personal manner. He explained that to get permission, he had to follow the government rules so that the court would look on his company with favour. Mr. Bowes then listed an overwhelming number of authorities he would have to approach, the man would have to approach for permission, and the man seemed daunted. Mr. Bowes said it was fine, he would help him through all of this maze of rules. Then Mr. Bowes asked him in a suddenly intimate tone if he had been feeling unwell. The man said he had and had tried various ritual solutions since his mother had died. Mr. Bowes explained that these ritual solutions would not help him, but only if he started to live and work with his brothers again as a joint family and carried out a ritual bathing in the Ganges would the man become well again. The man left very grateful and promised to come back. Now my point is that this polytonal exchange confirmed Mr. Bowes' access to a parallel realm of state and ritual forces that existed alongside the surface of reality. And in such a way these transactions of Jogo began. An intermediary zone of friendship was created, and in this personal promises and state promises and all sorts of powers could intermingle for mutual benefit. As relationships with owners and Golabaris developed further, Mr. Bowes began to help them in more direct ways. He'd actually worked out creative techniques to use state documents and his inspection powers to this end. For example, he did a very lively trade of drawing up contracts between Majis and Golabaris when they gave them loans. And these documents, in fact, had no legal force at all, but they mimicked the authority of state documents. And Mr. Bowes witnessed their signing. He turned official inspections also into negotiating site between different antagonistic parties on the river. For example, one day a boat owner asked Mr. Bowes for his help. He'd been forced to sell his boat at a lower than market rate to a gang of CPI-backed antisocials. But that inflated prices recorded in the title deed stored in the boat registration office. Now this man's own brother was now demanding a half cut of this false figure. So Mr. Bowes held an inspection of the boat to intimidate the party partners into giving a little more money to the original owner so he could pay off his brother. So what Mr. Bowes was doing was that he was inserting state tokens and his own authority into the practices of the informalised economy. His personal promises gave his friends access to a world of justice that ran parallel to these official lines of procedure, and the powers and documents of the state were dispersed within informalised networks. Mr. Bowes also forged connections through another means. He began to mimic the threats that are part of informal networks. For example, one day a sandboat owner arrived anxiously in Mr. Bowes' office. His boats had been seized by the river police when they were coming upriver for licensing at Mr. Bowes' office, and the police had asked for a huge bribe because the licenses were not on board. The boat owner explained that he had brought all the licenses in the morning to Mr. Bowes' office in readiness for their renewal, so Mr. Bowes knew that the licenses weren't on board the boats. Mr. Bowes assured the boat owner that he would phone up the river police to sort all of this out, but both I, the owner, and the other clients were left wondering whether this event was actually an accident. None of us had any proof, but we were all aware that the distance between the river police and Mr. Bowes was not as great as he liked to suggest. The port itself paid the river police to go on their raids on the river, and Mr. Bowes had often accompanied them. And it was unclear whether Mr. Bowes was party to the attempt to bribe the owner, or if he was simply using his connections to advance the owner's cause. Whatever the truth, our doubts greatly increased Mr. Bowes' authority over an arena of power parallel to official jurisdictions. This made Mr. Bowes' friendship a valuable, ambiguous resource that had to be carefully cultivated. Because friendship was spontaneously given, it could be just as quickly withdrawn, shutting down this intermediary zone of negotiation. Once forged, friendships focused on the speculative search for future profits in government rules and publicity schemes. State documents were not part of the distant actions of a legalistic authority. Instead, they were profitable rules. And Mr. Bowes and his friends liked to discuss future uses of the rules. And state publicity and tender announcements were also frequent topics. And through these incitations of speculation, Mr. Bowes had become connected as a consultant to several privately run shipyards and to all of the 20 companies running sand extraction on the river. Speculations between friends were in fact incitements to make things happen through Jogo, and these speculations continued over long lunches and endless mobile phone calls. And Mr. Bowes enrolled enrolled his most prized friends in an NGO called the Society for the Promotion of Human Growth, and these men travelled together to eye camps and various other charitable activities. Now, this incitement of speculation became fully clear to me several months into my research. As I arrived in his office one day, Mr. Bowes exclaimed, "There have been some major developments here, Laura. I've decided to give logistical support to producing a bajra for concerts on the river." Now, we'd spoken together about our nostalgia for these old Zamindari pleasure boats. Now, Mr. Bowes wanted to convert our shared enthusiasm into a practical scheme. He continued, "The people who can build this in their shipyard came in this morning. Then you came right afterwards. Also, the tourism board is encouraging this. Here is their publicity leaflet. This must be the work of God because you came into my mind and then you are here." Now, possibilities opening before my eyes, I actually started, in spite of myself, to talk about the practical details of this scheme. And as a way of explaining his acts, Mr. Bowes said, "This is God's work, his reason for putting me here in this chair." His assistant, as if on cue, took the prasad from the Ganesh sculpture that sat on his desk and shared it between us all. Mr. Bowes' next gesture was to provide us with some dramatic confidential news. He said, "I'm going to tell you a huge secret. They're going to close the Haldia port." On this day, actually, Mr. Bowes drew me fully under his speculative influence, and he achieved this through this polytonal display of divine destiny, state publicity, and disclosure of state secrets. And he actually has no other method to meet fiscal targets. And this method was in fact quite successful. Mr. Bowes was highly prized within the Port Trust for the revenue increases that he had achieved. He appeared at high-level meetings in the Marine Department and his suggestions were valued. And this was symptomatic of an overall loosening of bureaucratic hierarchies. Jogajog Kora had become a favoured mode of getting things done in the ranks of the bureaucracy as well. Now, importantly, as you will have seen already from the first photographs I showed you, these practices of Jogajog Kora were generating growing inequalities. Mr. Bowes' job was to preserve public safety in his official role, while on the other hand, he was increasing dangers to other citizens with his friendships. Now, to understand this, I want you to take you into the negotiations around the state tendering of a pontoon barge. One day, an engineer from a private firm arrived in Mr. Bowes' office. He showed Mr. Bowes the plan for a pontoon barge to see if he would be likely to approve it according to public safety rules. Mr. Bowes suggested to the man that he should outsource its construction to this shipyard, to Patra Shipyard, where Mr. Bowes was a consultant. As soon as the man had left, Mr. Bowes and I drove to Patra Shipyard carrying this man's plans. When we arrived, it was this stretch of open land, and actually there was a river that was dammed to make a makeshift dry dock. This is actually a state government barge being built in this dry dock. Now, the owner of the yard explained as we walked around it that Mr. Bowes had advised them to start their family business. He'd also helped them to get their first ever contract. And Mr. Bowes flourished the plans for the new pontoon barge in front of Mr. Patra and said, "This will be your next project." So Mr. Bowes was contributing to the growth of this dangerous informalised economy in Patra Shipyard, but these actions took place in a zone of complicit friendship. Only his signature on the tender documents and inspections for public safety would be visible as state promises. All his other productive actions would exist within the realm of personal promises. Such are the opacities created by the operation of economic complicity and friendship. Now, further inequalities are generated on the river through the distinctions drawn between friends and others, a quite distinct sentiment of sympathy-oriented bureaucrats' relationships with the labouring poor, and this operated on a hierarchical model of patronage that we're more used to hearing about in ethnographies of South Asia. Now, this was clear in Mr. Bowes' treatment of the requests of Mudgees or boatmen. Mr. Bowes drew entrepreneurs into friendship using eloquent Bengali, but a sharp line was drawn with Mudgees through his use of domineering, aggressive Hindi. Now, Hindi in Kolkata is often associated in public offices with the force of command over low-status workers. When Mudgees sought help from Mr. Bowes, he gave it grudgingly, lecturing on ethics and rules. And after they left, he and his friends would laugh about these examples of immorality, the Mudgees complaining of illegalities practiced against them. So what were the new structural forms of entrepreneurial society that had emerged from these practices? I've taken you deep inside these practices. Well, like all the other Marine Department officials I worked with, Mr. Bowes had lent the authority and documentary practices of the state to the informalised sector on the river. This had increased the power of Golobaris and Gotones over Mudgees and multiplied dangerous and formalised trades. Most importantly of all, the boat registration office had become a central site for the negotiation of the effective ties in formalised and state economies. Friendships created a liminal site for negotiation and speculation. In these personal state promises about the future would intermingle, and these relationships were generated through a play of complicity and a sense that this parallel world hovered just beyond reach of influence. But then actually, how did businessmen and Mudgees experience this new entrepreneurial society, forged through friendship on the Hooghly? I'm going to very briefly tell you a little bit about that, so you can see the other side of these relationships. So next I'm going to talk about one of these informal sector firms, a family firm called Eastern Private Limited. This is their yard on the banks of the Hooghly, and if you can see they're actually converting old state barges on the river itself into new uses. So there isn't really any infrastructure at all. So family firms and the invisible state, Eastern Private Limited. Now, the new private shipyards that had emerged on the Hooghly were all family firms that reassembled technologies and men from the state sector. And characteristic of these was Eastern Private Limited. Gradually, over 10 years, this company had taken on outsourced work in the port. It adapted the physical technologies that had been sold off by the Port Trust to fulfill this role. And many of its workers had previously worked in ship repairing in the Calcutta docks. On the basis of this expertise, the company now collaborated with very large international firms such as Larsen and Toubro. And it's hard to imagine looking at this yard. Now, it was passed on to the four Singay brothers who ran this firm by Mr. Bose, with whom they constantly negotiated schemes. They described him as an extraordinary man, a liquid man, who would flow to fit whatever vessel you gave him. Now here I want to concentrate on the Singay brothers' accounts of the sources of their own prosperity. What's important about these accounts is that they made the contribution of the state to their enterprise entirely invisible. Now the Singay brothers' accounts of the history of their firm contained it in a family story. They would begin with their great-grandfather and his elder brother, who had a business together producing jute. Family feuds followed, with each branch setting up large firms on the river. From 2000, the current generation had taken up contractual work for the port and private clients. Now, entirely absent from this account was any sense that their opportunities were affected by state actions or policy on the river. In fact, as Yaswant Singay put it, that is the world of government offices, and we cannot wait for them to make decisions. Their account was of the productivity of a family and of its seizing the fluid possibilities of capital that existed as an abstract force in the world. Now, for the Singay brothers, their creative power was most visible in their adaptation of these old state barges. They repeatedly described one object to illustrate this. They'd recently turned a barge that had been originally bought from the port into a pleasure boat called the Calcutta Riviera. They had converted it twice before. They cut it in half to act as a dredger for the port, and then into four to build a bridge with Larsen and Toubro. Now, this transformation of the waste of the state into something productive and beautiful, the Calcutta Riviera, for the brothers represented the ethic of the company. This ethic was also given substance by a religious company ethic of patronage and service to a higher power, the god Hanuman, which is very unexpected because they were Jains. This is not an automatic choice, nor were their workforce devotees of Hanuman. They were all very modest, and they associated the worship of Hanuman with the Hari made from outside Western Wall. So this was not an obvious choice, but they chose Hanuman, and all company vessels and offices contained lithographs of Hanuman, who was worshipped in the morning and the evening. A giant painting of Hanuman stared down on their yard. As Yaswant Singay put it, this was because Hanuman is a symbol of service to his master. If you look at it as a worldly thing, then whatever you do in life, if you dedicate yourself to a job or a master with a pure heart, you have to have success. Now, the brothers explicitly linked this ethic to their service to the force of capital and their patronage relationships with their temporary ununionized workforce. Now, my point here is that although Eastern Private's fortunes had been shaped by state officials, The four Singay brothers made these connections entirely invisible. Kinship, patronage, and the force of capital were foregrounded. And this is a consequence of the negotiation of economic governance through friendship. It creates this intermediary zone where the projects of the state and family businesses can intermingle. But it does this without dissolving the distinctions between them. It sustains the illusion of the market and the state as containing entirely different kinds of productive powers. And it's this distinction that underpins the first premises of policies of public-private partnership. Without it, the whole edifice of policies for rebalancing the inefficiencies of the public sector with the efficiencies of the private would crumble. So what do the working poor think of this new entrepreneurial society? I'm going to talk very briefly about informality and the new rights of entrepreneurial society and what Mudge's or Oakman made of this. So how then did the working poor experience this new entrepreneurial society? Here I'm going to focus on love boat Mudge's in the sex trade. So these are boats that they used to be used to carry loads from ships that anchored until the 1980s from all over the world in the centre of Calcutta. And they would carry loads and passengers from those ships, but now they're used mainly in the sex trade at night, because when they make most of their revenue, usually from soldiers from the local fort. So I'm focusing on love boat Mudge's, which is what they call themselves, because these men now occupy a particularly contradictory position. They're the most illicit and marginalised workers on the river, but they've been brought close to the state by the new licensing regimes. Ethnographies of similar boatmen in non-industrial settings show that they claim rights from the state as a caste community associated with the mythic history of the Ganges. Such examples follow the predictions of the literature on political society, in which it is argued that the urban poor exist within a zone of negotiated community rights gained through patronage. In contrast to this, Mudge's in Calcutta understand rights as individual titles guaranteed by the state that they earn through their labour. In fact, what is striking about their accounts is their refusal of the mythical history of the Hooghly and of patronage. These, they argue, belong to corrupt regimes that have destroyed the productivity of the river. And it's their refusal of patronage that makes them enthusiastic participants in the new entrepreneurial society on the Hooghly. And here I'm going to illustrate this through the account of this man who's guiding the boat, Abu Talim. Now, Abu Talim was in his 40s when I met him at Uchumgat, and he had first left his village south of Calcutta at the age of 8 and went to work selling sweets at the Ghat. And this was in the early 1980s when ships from all over the world used to moor here, and Abu looked on this time as a cosmopolitan era symbolised by the black sahibs who were sailors from the Caribbean that used to give him chocolate. He became an apprentice on one of the boats, one of these boats, that at that time was still carrying loads from the ships, and he remembered the productive past of the river with nostalgia and looked on the present with bitterness, saying, now this is just a wasteland, fuck-up, useless, unproductive space. It had become like this due to corrupt politicians, officials and unions. And he said he could not join any political party because he would simply get a bullet in his head, that they had all become so violent and corrupt. He linked recent problems on the waterfront to the actions of the police from Lal Bajar. Abu described how they arrested Mudge's so that they could be paid bribes to release them. And Abu suggested that the inequalities of the city would end if there was redistribution and mutual recognition of individual equality. He said there is no difference at all between rich and poor, it's just that one person wears fine clothes and the other wears rags. If someone had more than another, they should just give it on to them. But his central source of hope was that now at last, due to the actions of Mr. Bose, he possessed a Mudge licence. This, he said, was on permanent record in the registration office. It could not be denied by the police or anyone else. This, he said, would secure my future. He added, we too are part of the state now. Now Mudge's, such as Abu Talim, sought an ending of patronage and negotiated rights. The entrepreneurial society on the Hooghly had brought them one step closer to this through Mr. Bose's inclusion of them in the revenue streams of the state. Yet this society contained new sources of inequality. The urban poor now contributed part of the value of their labour to state revenues. They were also subject to the negotiations through friendship between entrepreneurs and bureaucrats. They were promised individual Majis did not yet complain of these new practices. They were partial co-creators of the new authority of the state on the river, for now the negotiations of friendship were invisible to them as a source of inequality. So now I'm going to conclude. Thank you for listening so far. So in my conclusion, I'm going to think about how we can think about economic governance differently from this example. And the first way is really, I think, the way that we think about the relationship between transparency and secrecy. Now here I've given you an account that runs against many discussions of neoliberal and liberalisation policy. These debates are focused on transparency and audit. The bureaucrats in the Calcutta Court Trust were also subject to audit regimes through state tendering, the Right to Information Act and fiscal targets, but their practices of Jogajog suggest that to focus on such regimes leads to a partial understanding of economic governance. There's a parallel world of secrets and complicity that exists alongside public accountability. This is a type of secrecy that has not yet been addressed in our theories of bureaucracy. The secrecy I've described is not the same as the office secret that preserves the domain of professional expertise that Weber writes about, nor is it similar to the shared complicity of the knowledge of a gap between the official and unofficial state, which is what Herzfeld writes about, and also Tausig. Nor is this the conjured world of conspiratorial secrets that creates an illusory image of an all-powerful state, which again Tausig has written about. This is a pragmatic, passionate and populist secrecy, through which state and personal promises are brought into relationship with each other. Now this activity becomes even more significant in contemporary forms of economic governance through public-private partnership. And so I would argue it's vitally important for us to examine secrecy alongside transparency if we're to understand these. The next thematic that I want to pick up on is that the relationship between audit and opacity. Economic planning always has unpredictable outcomes, but the forms of governance examined here produce a radical divergence between state promises or policies and plans and the reality generated by them. The content of policy becomes more loosely defined, producing devolved planning. Diverse visions of what prosperity might be are included in the practices of bureaucracies. Forms of popular nationalism, vernacular economic expertise, and popular religious imagery all rise up within the institution. In addition, state tokens and schemes are dispersed through society. In contexts such as India, where informalised work is widespread, this difference between state plans and outcomes increases even further. Now, importantly, it's very difficult for a political critique of this kind of economic governance to emerge. This is because all that is visible in the public domain are plans for prosperity, and the reality quite different from these. Now, this gap between plans for prosperity and plans to turn the Calcutta waterfront equivalent to the Thames or Singapore to be in play since the 1980s, this gap is widely understood by the citizens of Calcutta as a product of corruption. They can't see it as a product of the normal operation of liberalisation policy. Although we're focused on the depoliticising effects of audit, we also need to examine the effects of the opacity of this kind of speculative economic governance. The third theme that I want to pick out from this ethnography is the theme of speculation and the work of boundary production. Now, practices of Jogajog also reveal growing aspects of bureaucratic work that have remained under-analysed. We've assumed that bureaucrats govern the economy through knowledge and expertise, but we need to take seriously the stimulation of speculation. We need to track how various practices of complicity and publicity act to generate it. Finally, and most importantly, we need to trace the contemporary role of bureaucrats as kind of Janus-like figures who stand on the boundary between public and private economies, not between state and society, which is how Gupta has written about. They stand on this boundary between public and private economies. They alternately suspend and generate boundaries between the state and the market. Now, as I've shown, Jogajog or practices of useful friendship are the medium through which this is achieved. Through friendship, effective ties are improvised that never appear in the public domain, but which actively recreate economic life. Their invisibility helps to sustain an illusion that is key to the politics of the rebalancing of public and private sectors. The state and the market appear as distinct spheres containing different kinds of productive powers. Now, this separation between public and private economies is unlikely to disappear, and this is in part because it supports a profitable division between state labour and more precarious private sector. Yet perhaps, and that's why I will tell you it's still up on the slide, perhaps the sense that Mudgees have that they're drawing closer to the state may lead to a political critique that could undermine this separation between the market and the state. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Yes, it's not very nice to sit down. Thank you for that, Laura. Lots of new ideas and new connections in that paper. If I can use my privilege to ask the first question, I have several, but I'm going to ask just the one this time. I was, at the beginning, when you were describing the riverfront and the Hooghly and the port, I was, for reasons only known to my head, was actually started thinking about airports. And I was thinking of Marc Auger's work on non-place. And I was wondering, what is it about a river that actually allows it to forge not a non-place, but a place, of friendship, of ties, of bureaucracy, of state-making, with that, a place like the airport, all these sort of spaces of hypermodality in his work. I think that sort of... so what is it about the waterscape or waterfront that lends itself to a different kind of publicity and timing? So that would be my...
No, that's a really interesting question because I'd love to write a kind of, I won't do it, but I'd love to write a kind of Latour-esque book that was about the presence of the river because it's very true, as I've been writing my book manuscript, the river is there everywhere, but I can't sort of bring it in fully. It's kind of there as a very important element of this story. And it's partly about, there's partly something about the ways in which this economy already exists on the river. So this would be true probably in any of the spaces in Calcutta where connections are being made between a kind of speculative planning and entrepreneurial activity. So some parts of the story could be transferred to almost any site in Calcutta. Right. But there is something, there's a kind of very interesting thing about the river, both in terms of its very kind of its imaginative pull as well, because you can see the layerings of all the kind of previous histories of entrepreneurial endeavour on it, and this creates a kind of imaginative resource for people who work on it. And I mean that quite literally. So as you navigate down the river, as all these people are doing constantly, you're aware, from the charts where wrecks from the 19th century were. There's this kind of deep history of commercial entrepreneurial activity. There are ruins. There's a particular mosque that when you go down the river you have to salute in order to make sure that you have a safe journey, even if you're a Hindu, because that then invokes the history of Muslim entrepreneurship on the river, Lashkars, the history that we know about. And there's also the kind of remnants. People think of the river as actually not just a human-made, but a kind of man-made landscape. This is not, this is not a kind of again, this is not actually the way that Latour would imagine the river appearing to people. It doesn't appear as this nature that you're constantly trying to harness. It actually is productively produced by the actions of men. Indeed. So everybody knows where the spurs are that have reshaped the river again through the 19th, 20th century projects. So there is this kind of deep history of kind of commerce, entrepreneurship, international connection, which I think very much fuels this imagination. And then laid on top of that is the kind of sentimental nationalism, which I was sort of referring to in the discussion with Mr. Bose's attempts to create a Shona Bangla, and his sense of wanting to regain that prosperity that was lost once East Bengal, Bangladesh was lost. So that there's this very interesting, and of course you can imagine that reconnection with the river, because the waterscape itself, we think of the Hooghly, actually we've had a map, a watery map of the river. But if you look at the Hooghly River, it runs like this, there's the Ganges, which then turns into the Brahmaputra, runs like this, and the Hooghly River is like this small, tiny rivulet that comes off this bigger stream. But then joining it at the lower level, sort of through the Sundarbans and even in Kolkata itself, there are all of these watery networks that go into Bangladesh. So it's this huge imaginative resource. So I think your question is, this is not a non-place. It would not be a non-place.
No.
It's led with nationalist historical experiences of commerce and entrepreneurship.
Which even airports are. And that's what
I know, but I was going to say, I wonder whether...
Because its connections are made by flights, by cargo, you know, there's
I did have a
regulation.
dream of doing this. I live very near Southall, actually. I did have this dream, and I got very frustrated by the constant interpretation of the community in Southall as a kind of ethnic community. And I thought you could do a fabulous project. We're thinking about them as airport workers, you know, in a totally different way of imagining their orientation and reality. And so I think Auger's notion of this hyperreal space is flawed as well. Anybody with that kind of labour within the airport produces a particular kind of political consciousness and particular notions of the future. And I noticed I just received a leaflet the other day that one of the main protest groups against cuts in the Ealing area where I live, there was actually a group of Heathrow workers and union workers. So there's other stories to be told about the airport.
That's right.
Political and national and other sorts of consciousness. Yes.
You talk a lot about friendship and working with formal networks.
Yes.
And my question would be regarding crime.
Yes.
Ports and cities, port cities are very much associated with not only informal economy but also criminal networks, criminal activities. Even Singapore, which is a modern port city. And there's things being written on ports like Napoli or ports in Latin America. And I was wondering what feeling did you get or what's your opinion on this crime in this kind of friendship capacity and working from the economy of the state also.
Yes. Well, yes. There are many ways of understanding the association of crime with ports, actually. But I suppose, interestingly for me, the role that you're imagining of Napoli with mafia or whatever, would it be the mafia in the
Yes.
Yeah, obviously. So those networks are actually the party networks, the political party networks are sort of deeply connected into those kinds of shadowy world of dons and whatever else. And there's a kind of way in which Mr. Bose's efforts, you know, the positive part of this story of entrepreneurial society is that some of the hold of these organisations over the urban poor and their extraction of revenue from them is being reduced. But of course that doesn't mean that in Kidripur, where the docks are, that the dons are not still there. And in fact they're focusing their attention less on the port trade now and more on properties and forcing people out because of the huge land and property boom in Kolkata. So they're focusing as the profit has become and as the port has become more focused on drawing on these informal networks and making them more part of the legitimate activities of the port. They've shifted their attention to intimidating people out of properties and buying properties. They are still quite connected in with the unions, who interestingly, and another story from another chapter, another paper, there's a kind of nexus between the informal sector brokers of labourers, like you see in the shipyard there. The people who are the brokers for that labour are both union officials, CPM union officials, and they're connected into the illicit crime networks. And so that's why the workers are in, not just the Mudgies, but all of the informal sector workers are in such a problematic position. They have no recourse, apart from the possibility of these state documents or being drawing closer to the state through these low-level bureaucrats. So that's an important part of the story. And that's what Abu Talib was expressing. He was expressing that illicit nexus, that all the agents of the state, the union, the agents of the police, the unions, and the party networks are also criminalised.
All of you to speak and we'll speak after that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Louise.
It's fine.
I have a question on the train of fact. I'm not an anthropologist, so apologies in advance. But I wondered, I'd be interested to hear, and I can see that you're kind of doing some interesting things, looking at the kind of state-society relationship and the way we think about bureaucracy. But I wondered where your kind of notion of friendship sits, and whether you're trying to do something distinctive there, because you're thinking of the way that you describe these friendships as kind of complicit, speculative endeavours. It seems like a rather different way of thinking about friendship, that these are actually kind of transactional relationships that depend upon the sharing of concealed knowledge and pursuit of mutual self-interest. I suppose those are probably constitutive if there is a friendship, in the anthropological literature, itself. But I'd be interested to kind of, hear what you're doing with the theory of friendship and bringing it.
I'm doing something thank you very much for that, because I'm doing something very, very intentional here.
Yeah.
I'm both writing against the reading of these relationships as corruption, because I think corruption doesn't explain anything. You've already explained what's going on when you label something corruption.
Yeah.
If I'd called these things corruption, I would never have been able to make the links to the shifts in policy, to the changing forms of debt, relationships within the state. I would have just said, oh, this is corruption. I could have sat in that office and said, oh, what I'm seeing is corruption. Right? So that's one point of calling it friendship, to disturb that category of corruption. But also I'm trying to disturb our category of friendship as well, in the same way that Simmel does in his work, which is, I think there is, and I don't know, I think it might even be John Carey that's written about this, but there is a kind of romance of friendship within capitalism, which Simmel, interestingly, to some point plays into by saying that friendship retreats to the private sphere with the emergence of the state. And I'm saying, no, it retains this element of threat, complicity. I know it sounds awful, sounds terribly. My friendships are not like this. but I think that we are very blinded to, and the thing that got me really agitated enough to want to write this paper and to call it friendship was actually reading, oddly, Granovetter's economic sociology. Because he argues that there's this kind of information exchange through networks, it's all relatively benign, it may unintentionally produce inequality, but the basic relationships are very benign. And I thought that was entirely misleading, and again kind of reproduces a romance of friendship, not just within capitalism, but within the market, right? So part of what I'm writing against is that kind of romanticism around relationships that support the market, which Granovetter would call friendship. So this doesn't really have anything to do with anthropology, actually. It has to do with, the public discourses in India that they would call this, people would call what they see around them a product of corruption. And I'm saying, no, we need to look at what the liberalisation state is producing. Sorry to get through it.
I came a bit late, I'm sorry. I was at another meeting here. I don't know if you introduced yourselves. Came first. Before you introduce yourselves. My name is Meera Lal, and I am a doctor, a medical doctor. I've done a PhD on biopsychosocial health. And the reason I came here is that my PhD looked at women's health in a different manner. I'm a specialist in women's diseases. So sociology, psychology, health of public, and psychiatry, these are the things in my PhD. So many pieces in the world. I was born there.
Where were you born?
Sorry, I didn't
No, I get very emotional when I say
that. Near to Denver. My father was in the
Did your father work in the docks?
He was in the jute industry.
Yes.
About 6,000 people under him. So I'm really amazed at what you've done. Language barrier is always there. My father knew global languages. And because because the British were in India at that time, in the jute industry especially, we had mixed friends when we were kids. And my mom's parties used to have like British, European food and Indian food. And the schools were like, we went to first language was English, but we learned Bengali and Hindi as well. We spoke to workers like we heard from my father. He was like a social uplift type of person. So he changed the living situation for workers, like fans, rooms, things like education for the children. And you worked differently. We went to a convent school opposite. The Marshals used to come and take us to the school to teach in that. And the river was really fantastic. It was like a peaceful thing. It never flooded in that area. And I used to say bye to the ships when I was small, 2 years old or 2 to 3, I remember. But when I went to school, I learned about the beauty of the river.
It is amazing when you go to the middle of the river because the city falls away.
Yes.
Because it's so low, the buildings. Yes. It's extraordinary. That's, again, talking about why the river produces these sentiments and possibilities. It is an extraordinary place. And I think, I don't know if you've been back recently, but it's very, it's all, it's been totally, because of this debt regime, the extraction of resources to the central state, all of those old port buildings have become practically derelict. They've got squatters in them. The schools are practically shut, the port schools, and the rest. It's an absolute kind of destruction of that kind of paternalist, which obviously was flawed because not everybody was included in it, right? But there was a kind of paternalist project there, which and very, very strong. The early years of unionism in the port just after independence were extraordinary because they did, the people in the port, the dock unions did consistently build up rights for workers until about until the 1970s, and then past 1970s when it became much more problematic. So I haven't seen those times, but I've read about
water license in the river, the different seasons in the river. It is very peaceful. You could see the barges laden with jute going, and it has come from Bangladesh to the war.
Yes.
And we sort of had a friendship for everyone. We also felt that, like one of my cooks, mom's cooks was from Bangladesh. A finger had been cut off, but one man was working, and my father used to employ people. So I'm saying, Mr. Bose, what he's done, he's trying to find out how to regenerate that area economically, and you have to bribe people. My father was very honest with bribes, so he had a person for this, an officer who would get the police and other political people, because they can damage workers. And he had started the safety thing, safety for workers and everyone. And you were talking about the criminology and other things. It's very difficult because sometimes you find a barge has been killed at night, something has happened. So you have done amazing work, I must say, in this regeneration. I think every river has this potential. When you go to Amazon or you go anywhere, Thames, along the banks, industry and economic growth for the people.
It's fascinating. People on the river were very interested in what had happened to just to bring it back here, and were very interested in what had happened to the London docks in the 1980s, and were always horrified but wanted to hear what had happened, that it was basically a political decision to finally close the docks in the 1980s, and it was taken almost overnight. And every time I go to Tower Bridge, I feel its absence.
You feel the same in Liverpool. You go to Glasgow, any of these places where there have been a lot of life at some stage, and now you can see some aspects, there's really downtrodden in some areas. And it will not have. It's a natural source. We don't have to pay for it. We can make use, like you have shown being done, whether it's for leisure, whether it's from the sand. You call it the sand, we used to call it clay, because they use it for the images. And building, of course, cement and everything. But also fish they used to use a lot.
Does anyone else have a question before we get further into this conversation?
I had a couple actually. Unfortunately, I missed the first round. corruption. So what do you think is, or if you were inspired in your research, what do you think the actual reason for these gentlemen to perform whatever, this kind of ritual and friendship in order to regenerate the port and the bank? I mean, if it's not corruption, what is it? Is it self, I don't know, not self-esteem, but sort of trying to reach some sort of power, or kind of, because he said also he sits on the board of a quite high up authoritative organisations or municipalities. So I was wondering, what's your perception?
Yes. I mean, I've always, part of the answer about why we love Club Port is because I've always worked in West Bengal, and I mean, that doesn't really answer. I actually started out thinking about doing this specific project for two reasons. One, which was I always used to go past the docks when I was going to do my earlier work in the Southeastern Railway headquarters. I would see the docks, and what fascinated me was that Calcutta is a city that has forgotten that it was ever and still is a maritime city. And I thought, how is this possible? It's the opposite of somewhere like Liverpool or even Mumbai, which is aware of this. And I thought this makes it particularly interesting to insert that story of Calcutta as a port city back into the mainstream understandings of it, not just in the past but in the present, and particularly in the present in terms of, it's very interesting, people in India, and probably not just in India, but lots of places, when they think about globalization, think of it as an intangible process, right? But actually everything that people in the city of Calcutta think of as being a sign of globalization, which is mainly forms of consumerism, comes up the river on these ships. But people are entirely unaware of this, and they think that globalization is something else, as a computer screen. So I thought that this was particularly interesting. I had a personal interest, but I've always worked there, but I thought this was particularly interesting, a city that has forgotten its global roots, its cosmopolitan roots, and is denying them in the present, and yet it thinks that globalization is happening through another form, even though it's happening in this way. And then I think, the story that you can tell about Calcutta Port, you could tell in different ways about other ports in India. So, and there's the whole question of private ports. Obviously, they're seen as the next way. There are plans to develop them on the Hooghly as well. But, the question of corruption or motivation. I mean, what I was trying to convey, first of all, in the paper is that, liberalization and economic pursuits have passions and enthusiasms built into them as well. There is something, it's very hard to imagine, but even in the Eastern Private project, there is a kind of enthusiasm and passion and satisfaction that comes from creating and producing activity and businesses or whatever else. So part of my refusal to kind of read it through an individual instrumental logic, or what might be called corruption, is also wanting us to recognise that, and as part of a kind of broader project that I'm trying to think through, which is to think of economy in terms of generative economy. So for the Singh brothers, what's interesting about building up this business is not money, right? It is the possibility of regenerating their family in a certain way. It's about their emotional ties to their family. For Mr. Bose, he had particular kinds of ambitions, which were to do with very strongly nationalist visions of regeneration. He also had a kind of family project. He had a daughter who he wanted to educate, as he hadn't been able to be educated. But, so I think that, I think that corruption, we already know what, when you say corruption, you've already decided what people's motivations are. You've already decided in a cynical way that, unlike us, they are corrupt, right? Or that they're not motivated. I mean, we don't, and obviously we're academics, so we don't work for money, but, we all, and actually this was very striking to me in the shipyard as well, men who you would think of as being totally driven by concerns of subsistence economy, getting by, are not just concerned with that. So I think, economic motivation only explains a very small part of what goes on in economics.
ask one last wrap-up question, just before he goes, connected with this discussion on friendship and I'm very strongly welcome getting away from corruption as a narrative of economic life. But I was also then wondering, thinking of, say, Pandyan's work on cultivation of virtue. But I was thinking, where is virtue? And is it virtuous life? Is it affective life? Is or is it all those kinds of things? So what is Mr. Bose's understanding of friendship in that sense? So is it responsibility? Is it affect? Is it virtue?
Yes. Yes. It absolutely is, and in the longer part of the paper, I spent a lot more time describing his ethics, actually, and other people's ethics. But obviously, in a kind of short presentation, you can't really do that. And in a sense, that relates to the point that I've just been making about the kind of generative economies. It is kind of a kind of fuller idea than maybe this suggested in this form. So I'll just have to give you the longer.
Yes.
I don't know. I'm sure there's lots more I can say about it another time, but probably I'll just leave it. Yeah.
So, I should probably carry on the discussion in the bar.
That would be very nice.
Long drink. Thank you very much for your paper, Laura. Thank you for some very new work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So is this a chapter?
This is a chapter because look.